We are going to turn to the word of the Lord now. And about 3 years ago, I did a series. It was when I had sort of just started here as the pastor. I did a series looking at mental health, mental wellness, and how the things of God, the gospel, relates to that. And we are going to call this the sequel to that series that we did way back when. It's not a rehash of that material, but we're going to sort of look at some new material looking at the way that the gospel and the Lord relates to us when it comes to our mental health and mental well-being. And where's my clicker? There it is. We're going to start today in a passage in the book of Matthew. We're going to be reading Matthew 11, and we'll be reading verses 28 to 30. James has kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke that he asks me every Sunday morning when we're doing the run-through. Do you have your sermon ready for today, Pastor Dale? And the answer is always yes, and the answer is yes today too. However, I will say this was a weighty one for me to write, and so I'm trusting that what I share will minister to you. And there were even this morning some last-minute edits, so I hope that the Lord will speak through it. But let's hear the word of the Lord together. Matthew 11, starting at verse 28. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. And may the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word. I grew up in Alberta back in the 80s. And this might be hard for some of you to believe, given how fancy playgrounds are these days. But back then, our playground equipment was simply a bunch of old tires stacked up on top of each other. I'm not joking here. We used tractor tires, and so some of them were gigantic, but still, that is all we had. I am telling you this so that you will be able to visualize it when I say that back when I was 10 or 11, one of the things I did at recess was I would take the Gideon Bible that they had given me at the start of grade 5. Does anyone here remember the olden days when they used to give kids these little red New Testaments at the start of the school year? I see some hands out there. Well, I would take my bright red New Testament by myself to the far side of the playground, and then I would squeeze my entire body inside one of those old tractor tires, and once I was inside, completely hidden from view, I would read the book of Revelation. Now, if you are new to the Bible, you may need to know that the book of Revelation is one of the most difficult and, truth be told, probably one of the scariest books in the whole entire thing. It is about the end of the world, and it is filled with visions of, visions of seven-headed dragons devouring people whole, and demons being cast into the lake of fire, stuff like that. And I'm not sure that I should mention this or admit it in church, but it probably won't surprise you to know that I would usually come in from recess completely traumatized. By the way, I'm going to be using that word a fair bit in today's sermon, and so I should probably take a minute to clarify, because there are at least two ways that we use the term traumatized, right? One is the technical way to describe it when somebody has experienced violence, or maybe had a close brush with death, and they are literally suffering from the effects of post-traumatic stress. And this is very serious. It's a very real condition with very specific symptoms, and it's nothing to make light of. The other way we use the term, though, is the colloquial way to describe everyday kinds of hurt and fear. Like I don't know, if a boy and a girl, they go through a really bad breakup, right? We might say, that was a traumatic breakup. It's not literally PTSD that they are experiencing necessarily, but still it hurts, right? Some people would say we shouldn't ever use the word trauma for those everyday kinds of hurts because it can minimize the very real experience of people who really have been traumatized. And there is some truth to that. But even so, I'm going to be using that word traumatized in both senses of the word today, although I will do my best to make it clear which sense of the term I mean when I use it. All of which brings me back to 10-year-old Dale, stumbling into grade 5 math class after recess, eyes as wide as saucers, scared out of his wits because of what he had just read in the book of Revelation. And if you can see him there, and more importantly, if you can understand what I mean when I say that it was a kind of religious trauma that he experienced. Not in the technical sense, although there is a way that people can be spiritually traumatized in the technical sense, which we will talk about later on today. But in the more general sense, it was kind of traumatizing for him, wasn't it? To read something like the book of Revelation at age 10 with no one there to help him process it properly. If that makes sense to you, then maybe you'll be ready to hear Jesus today in Matthew 11, when he tells us that he never meant for our experience of following him to be traumatic. In any sense of that word, religious trauma was not anything he wanted his followers to experience. In fact, Whitby Church, Jesus meant for us to find relief from our religious trauma. That's how I want to sum up this passage today anyways. Although you would be excused if you were left scratching your head, wondering, what does this passage today have to do with trauma of any kind? So let me explain, and let me start by dwelling for a minute on the language that Jesus uses to describe the kind of rest he wants for us when we are, how did he say it, weary and heavy burdened. Because in verse 29, he talks about this in terms of us taking his yoke upon us, is how he says it. Now, strictly speaking, a yoke was what they used back in the olden days to hitch the oxen up to the plow when they wanted to plow the field. It's the harness that went across the ox's shoulders, right? So obviously, Jesus is using this term as a metaphor. But what exactly is it a metaphor for? To answer that, it might help you to notice that he also calls his yoke a light burden. And when you hunt through the rest of Matthew's gospel for other places where Jesus talks about people having to bear a burden, you will see that that term shows up in only one other place in the whole entire gospel. It's in Matthew 23, verse 4, where Jesus is calling out the religious leaders of his day, the Pharisees they were called. He's calling out the Pharisees in scathing terms for using their religious power to control the people that they're supposed to be leading. And he says it like this. These Pharisees, they tie up heavy burdens. And in the Greek language, it's the exact same word as he is using here in Matthew 11. They tie up heavy burdens and they put them on people's shoulders and they won't lift a finger to help them out. So, if religious trauma is defined as the pain and the distress that people experience from participating in an authoritarian or dogmatic or controlling religious group or a belief system that's like that, and that is the technical definition of religious trauma. But if that is what it is, then these Pharisees were literally causing people religious trauma. And when Jesus saw it in Matthew 23, verse 4, he said, it's like they're putting a heavy burden, an unbearable yoke on people's shoulders. Because for Jesus, this language of burdens and yokes has to do with how we experience our faith and how we express our spirituality, how we practice our religion. And just in case you feel I'm maybe reading too much into the linguistic connection between Matthew 11 and Matthew 23, let me also point out to you Acts 15, verse 10. It comes much, much later in the story when the church is trying to figure out what should we tell new converts to Christianity about what it means to follow Jesus. Like what requirements should we establish for them for living like a Christian? And at that point, the debate was all about what rules and regulations from the Jewish faith that Christianity had emerged from, which of those rules and regulations should still be binding for Christians today? And they're batting it back and forth in intense terms. And at one point in the discussion, one of the Christian leaders stands up and he says, brothers and sisters, we shouldn't try to test God by putting on the necks of these new converts a yoke that we ourselves were unable to bear. Does that sound familiar? You see, in the New Testament, the idea of bearing a yoke was a way of talking about how you are practicing your faith. And in Matthew 11 here today, Jesus offers us his yoke. And he calls it an easy yoke. Which is to say, unlike the yokes on offer by the Pharisees, it is not spiritually oppressive or abusive or traumatizing. Because Whitby Church, Jesus meant for us to find relief from our religious trauma. I say it like that he meant for us to find relief, because the truth is that sometimes people's experience of Christianity has not brought them relief. Instead, it's become a source of religious trauma. Some of you may know that around this time last year, I was traveling in Saskatchewan, the promised land. And on my way home, my flight got snowed in, and so I had to spend a weekend all by myself, holed up in a hotel room in Saskatoon. And I did what all of you would have done. I started listening to a Christian podcast, right? Well, this was a podcast that a lot of leaders had been talking about, Christian leaders, when it first came out. And I had never had the time to listen to it when it first was produced. And so I thought, well, I've got a whole weekend. Why not now? The podcast is called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And it painstakingly chronicles the story of a megachurch that rose to prominence in Seattle in the late 90s and early 2000s. And when I say painstaking, I do want to put the accent on the word pain. Because by all accounts, the ministry of this church caused a lot of pain to a lot of people. There were like 19 episodes each in the whole podcast, 19 episodes, and each one was about 40 to 50 minutes long. But I was by myself for a whole weekend, and so I sort of binge listened to the whole thing beginning to end, and I would not recommend you do that. I sort of felt traumatized in the non-technical sense of the word. I felt traumatized when I was done, because it details story after story of the ways this particular ministry used religious power to control and manipulate people. The way it placed unbearable yokes on people, all to stroke the egos and feed the agendas of the people in authority. I am not here to sling mud at another ministry. I will not do that. So I will let you listen to the podcast on your own and draw your own conclusions. But I will say that sadly, the story of Mars Hills is not an isolated one-off. Because there are lots of people whose exposure to religion has left them traumatized in both senses of the word. Stories that will never get a podcast, but they are just as painful. As a Christian pastor, it breaks my heart to say that. But I would not be telling the truth if I didn't acknowledge that it's the case. You might be thinking, gee, Pastor Dale, I thought this series was supposed to be about mental health and the gospel. Where did all of this talk about religious trauma come from? So let me say that there are two reasons we are starting this series here with this clear assurance from Jesus that he meant his followers to find relief from their religious trauma. The first reason is just this. You see, throughout this series, I am going to be suggesting that the Christian faith, knowing Jesus and following Jesus, that can be a profound source of spiritual resources to help us navigate mental health challenges and manage them and recover from them. That is and will be one of the most basic premises in this series, that faith can actually help us in our struggles with mental unwellness. But the truth is that often people with mental challenges don't experience it like that. In fact, it's often the opposite, where faith actually becomes an additional source of distress for them, and this is especially true if they have experienced religious trauma in the past. I mean, talking to someone about how Jesus wants to help them with their mental health, when one of the reasons they're struggling is because of the wounds that they have experienced at the hands of people who claimed to follow Jesus, that would only amplify their struggles, I think. It certainly would not be compassionate or fair. Which brings me to the second reason I chose to start this series here today, which is just this, that religious trauma, and this time I mean it in the technical sense of the word, religious trauma is a real thing. And it is itself a mental health challenge that some people struggle with. It can be caused when someone has been physically abused by a person in a position of religious authority. But it does not have to be that specific. It can be caused when a religious leader uses spiritual fear tactics to control people. When people are taught that they can't question any aspect of their belief system or else God will hate them. When spirituality is used to coerce or manipulate or gain power over others. I want to say this very carefully today, because I do not want to say anything that might be like triggering, right, for anyone who may have experienced those things. I just want to acknowledge it at the very outset of this series on mental health and Jesus, that sometimes the way people have experienced the Christian faith has not helped their mental health. Sometimes it's only made things worse. I had a friend a long time ago. Today we'll call them Ashley. It's not their real name, but my friend grew up in an extremely conservative Christian tradition. The kind of tradition where kids would be taught about the lake of fire from the book of Revelation in Sunday school on the flannel graph. Never mind secretly reading it in the tire park at recess, right? And when I got to know Ashley, they were a very devoted follower of Jesus Christ. They were deeply involved in the life of our church community, and they loved God very much. And I didn't know enough about it at the time to say so back then, but looking back, my impression is that Ashley probably struggled with some kind of diagnosable depression. They certainly experienced many of the symptoms of clinical depression. But one of the ways their depression showed up most in their lives was in the form of a deep down fear that they might have committed the unforgivable sin. You see, at some point in their religious experience, Ashley had been taught that there was a sin. Now, it was a very specific sin, and no one would be very clear about what it entailed. It was never explained carefully, but there was a sin that was so heinous that if you committed it, even unintentionally or accidentally, still, if you did, God would never forgive you, and you would end up damned for all eternity. Now, this teaching was based on a very bad misreading of a place in the New Testament where Jesus says that if somebody blasphemes the Holy Spirit, they will not be forgiven of that sin. And this is not a sermon on that passage, so feel free to ask me after the service on my thoughts about what the unforgivable sin is. My point is just this, that Ashley often struggled profoundly with this vague sense of shame and fear, because they believed that they were guilty of this thing called the unforgivable sin. And as a result, in their darkest moments, they deeply believed that God just wouldn't love them. So I have learned enough about trauma since those days to know how careful we need to be not to offer pat answers, glib responses when someone is deeply struggling. But even so, if Ashley were here today, or if there is somebody listening who is there now where Ashley was, carrying an unbearable spiritual yoke because of untrue things they had been taught to believe about God, I just want to say what Jesus says in Matthew 11. That he never meant for anyone to experience spiritual trauma following him. I don't say that only because of what he says here in Matthew 11. I say it actually because of how he proved it to us in the cross of Jesus Christ. I mean, if you stop to think about it, the cross of Christ was, among all the other things it was the most religiously traumatic event in human history. Like when you strip it all down to its bare essentials, what happened at the cross? An innocent man was falsely accused by the religious power brokers of his day, accused of breaking the religious rules that they saw it as their job to enforce. And as a result of that accusation, he was subject to the worst kind of humiliation and trauma imaginable: execution by crucifixion. But Whitby Church, the New Testament is crystal clear about this fact, that when he hung dying on the cross like that, that was God in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Which, if it's true, like if God really was there in Christ when he endured that religious trauma, if that really was God suffering on our behalf, then it would mean, wouldn't it? It would mean that God is actually on the side of the religiously traumatized. That he is there for them, and he is with them, and he is compassionately present to them. And any form of religion that causes spiritual trauma is most emphatically not of him. If you have been religiously traumatized, I won't offer pat answers, but I will urge you to know that that was not anything that Jesus intended. And what he most wants for you is to find relief. I would like to leave you with that today, simply with the compassion that God showed us. The compassion especially that God showed the traumatized in the cross of Jesus Christ. Because I realize that today's sermon is more like the start of a conversation than the final word on one, because there is no way that I could say in one short sermon all of the things that need to be said about religious trauma, especially if you have actually experienced it and are trying to recover from it. So maybe the best I can do today is just to lead us to the cross of Christ and trust that the Lord will minister to each of us in his wisdom. But I would like to say a word to our community as a whole here in closing. Because we need to understand that Jesus is not just offering relief to the traumatized in this passage today. He is also calling his followers to be communities that do that. Communities that do not cause spiritual trauma, but instead help people to heal from it. And if we really want to hear that call today, we would take some time to ask Jesus. Very gently we'd do it, and very humbly we would do it. But we would ask him if and where we may have caused pain in the past, how we might be causing it now by the way we're holding our faith or practicing our religion. Are we being a community that, this is a rhetorical question and I do not have an answer in mind when I ask it. I really don't. Are we being a community that causes religious trauma to others? Or are we maybe a bit more like the Valley of Rivendell in J.R.R. Tolkien's classic children's book, The Hobbit? Okay, I know I had a reference to Tolkien in a sermon right before Christmas, but this is the new year, right? And my quota for Tolkien references gets reset every new year, doesn't it? Amen. Okay. Well, either way, in the book Rivendell is the home of a very wise elf called Elrond. And Bilbo and the dwarves, they decide they're going to visit him on their way to kill the evil dragon Smaug. And by this point in their journey, they have been attacked by trolls, and they have been pummeled by giants. They've been harried and harassed and exhausted. They are, in other words, they are traumatized by what they have been through. And I want to read for you the description of what they experience when they finally make it to Elrond's house. But before I do, I just really want to be crystal clear on what I'm talking about here when I use this as a metaphor for a church that helps the traumatized heal. Because a non-traumatizing church would be one that nurtures empathy and understanding and embraces difference. It would be a place where people held their beliefs humbly and did not use doctrine to control others. It wouldn't use fear tactics to make converts or make belonging conditional on a certain way of acting. It would be able to ask hard questions about faith and difficult questions about God without feeling threatened by them or becoming defensive. And it would have healthy structures in place to make sure its leadership was accountable and transparent, including and especially the pastoral leadership. It would be a place that honored authenticity. And it would not hold up unhealthy things, like having no emotional boundaries or conforming to groupthink. Those things wouldn't be celebrated as though they made you more spiritual than everybody else. It would be, in other words, it would be a little bit like Elrond's house from The Hobbit. Can I read you the description now? Because this is what the party tasted when they finally made it to Rivendell. Tolkien writes, L. Ron's house was perfect. Whether you liked food or sleep or work or storytelling or singing or just sitting and thinking best, it was a pleasant mixture of them all. Evil things did not come into that valley. And his house was a refuge for the weary and the oppressed, because a treasury of good counsel and wise lore was there. A refuge for the weary and the oppressed. Whitby Church, may Jesus in his wisdom make us a little bit more like that each day as we continue to follow him.